Welcome. You're listening to The Weather Lounge, a podcast by WeatherWorks. Get ready to explore the world of weather and connect with engaging guests, bringing you fun and thought-provoking stories of just how weather shapes our lives, sometimes in ways you've never imagined. So, join us as we unravel the mysteries of the atmosphere. Today's episode starts right now.
Hello there, and thanks for joining us in the Weather Lounge. I'm meteorologist Brad Miller, and joining me for today's podcast is fellow WeatherWorks meteorologist and producer Mike Priante, and of course our tropical specialist Steve Copertino. Gentlemen, welcome as usual.
Well, hello.
Great to be back.
Yeah, we're recording this as on August 20th, and it feels a little bit like October 20th here in the Northeast.
Oh yeah, it's cold out there this morning. Now it was
Cold,
in the 50s
come on, Mike.
for me.
It's beautiful. I'll take it. It's
It is.
beautiful.
It is definitely our first taste of fall here. It's just got that feel out there after the heat and humidity of the last couple of months and the tropical rains this past weekend, unfortunately, for parts of New England. Significant flooding, of course, we saw. But the good news is, we're going to settle into a quieter pattern going forward here, at least for the next week or so. And, and since we have Steve on, you know what that means, right?
I don't know. You got to tell me, Brad. I'm kind of out of the loop.
Well, it's time to talk about what's happening in the Atlantic Basin. We had Steve on, I think it was right before the 4th of July weekend. We were talking about Beryl. That was the big tropics talk then. We had Kyle on last month, just kind of navigating through the start of the season. And, we're only about 3 weeks away now from the peak of hurricane season. So we figured we'd check in with Steve here. And Mike, we've been talking about this stuff too. And then, we've been chit-chatting about it's kind of been a bit of a slow start, but I don't think that has anything to do with the ultimate outcome still. But it's something, curiosity, that's all right now. And a lot of chit-chat on social media about it too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we did have some pretty impressive storms, especially early on with Beryl, Debbie hitting, the southeastern United States with all the flooding, Ernesto with Leeward Islands, Puerto Rico, and even Bermuda. But outside of that, named storm-wise, only having 5 through about now, I really don't think anyone would have really seen that coming. But
yeah. Chris was about 4 hours worth of a storm.
Yeah. They'll go back and change that. I think they actually already did, but there was first our A storm, and then Chris, not really all that long lived there.
But you know what? It's amazing that we're only 5 names into the season, mid to late August, and 2 of them already have been significant. One, of course, was the big one, Beryl. That racked up a lot of ace. But Debbie was known for, the very slow movement. It crawled its way. It took about, 4 to 5 days to go from where the northern side of Cuba or near the Bahamas to get to finally the Carolinas.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the ace point's actually really interesting. From a named storm perspective, we're right around normal for now. But in terms of ace, we're actually the 3rd highest on record right now. And this is going back 74 years. So the only other years that are higher than us right now are 1980 and 2005. And the ones below us are really, really active years like 1995, 1969, a couple in the 50s. So, in terms of ace, we're kind of right around where we thought things would be. We had a really quiet July, and it's been relatively quiet, especially the last week or so outside of Ernesto.
Yeah. Ernesto was just bothersome mainly for the the islands down the Caribbean, and then of course, like you mentioned, Bermuda, which really took a direct hit. But thankfully, it could have been. It could have been a lot worse, obviously, because at first we were thinking it may have been a major hurricane, but there was still a lot of sheer and dry air around the storm, so it kind of kept it at bay. But not to make light of a Category 1 hurricane, but still, we know with Ernesto, we were watching it, and at first we're thinking, oh, this could be a big storm for Bermuda, but Thankfully, it just kind of went through as a Cat 1, which to us here in the Northeast would be a pretty big concern. But island like Bermuda, they can handle that. They're built for that kind of stuff. So again, good thing it didn't really strengthen too much.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and it's finally wrapping up. It briefly intensified when it was over the Gulf Stream. I believe it was yesterday.
I did notice that it had its best organization actually after it went by Bermuda.
Exactly. That's exactly right. It was like this nice symmetrical classic looking hurricane for a brief period. I think got back up to like 90 miles an hour. So yeah, an interesting little storm there.
And it seems like a lot of storms do that. They hit like a sweet spot in the North Atlantic just for like
Exactly.
a
Yeah.
4-hour window. And
The thing was moving at 25, 30 miles an hour when it was starting to get going. It really never had a chance to like fully align and significantly strengthen. But yeah, it found a little sweet spot way the heck out in the North Atlantic, and it did its thing. But now it's a remnant low, and that's about it.
yeah, and again, like you just said earlier, who would have thought on August 20th we have no name storms in the Atlantic Basin?
Yeah, yeah, and there's really nothing. The part that really surprises me, not that you should trust these like day 10, day 15 model outputs. Like the thing that's very interesting to me, and I think that everyone's trying to figure out, is why the models aren't showing anything going forward the next 2 weeks or so. Usually, when conditions are very favorable like this, you'll see some kind of ghost storms pop up here and there, but there really hasn't been anything. That's really going to be kind of interesting to see how that develops over the next week or so, especially as we get to around September 1st. I mean, we can go into the why of things have been quiet lately. I For July, it really was there's this. It's kind of like a conveyor belt in Africa. The tropical waves that emerge and eventually develop into storms out in the Atlantic, they ride this conveyor belt throughout the season. Right now, it's
Cape Verde storms, basically, for the island chain right there on the west coast of Africa.
yes, exactly. So basically, that conveyor belt's a little bit, it's at its furthest north point, but it's also a few degrees more north than usual, which when these waves start to move into Western Africa, their circulations drag a tremendous amount of dust
Right up the
from the
Sahara,
Saharan
probably.
desert. Yeah, and it just deposits that right into the Atlantic, and they get caught up in all that dust, and it's extremely hard for them to develop. Debbie was an exception, but uh, it really is hard to do. So every single wave since then has kind of struggled and just really petered out. But the other thing we've kind of been seeing is that there's kind of like a monsoon trough kind of setup. It's very, very strange for this time of year in Western Africa. So these waves are also getting caught up in that, and they're very broad, very sloppy. And again, they just don't have what it takes to develop. So um, I think what we're going to have to see here is this large scale upward motion over Africa kind of have to shift east and away. So we see that conveyor belt that we've been talking about shift more to the south, and we can kind of get these Cape Verde storms to develop like you usually see into September.
Right, because when all the hurricane outlooks come out, and of course WeatherWorks does theirs too, and we see the conditions in the Atlantic, the Gulf, and the high quote fuel, that if you will, is all there. But subtleties like things like that, we don't know what it's going to look like come July and August. We're thinking back in May and June, like it would just be a typical wave train far enough south in latitude to where they just kind of roll off and make their way across the Atlantic. But like you said, this one, it's a little more of a subtle thing that it's more of a nowcast thing that you see it happening, and until it can shift, then we'll get back to more of a generic, or not generic, a more traditional kind of Cape Verde season, I would imagine.
Exactly, and like it's important to note. I think every single storm we've had outside of our first storm there has been from these tropical waves. We haven't seen any kind of random subtropical development or some stalled fronts off the coast that try to develop, like 2020. With their insane 30 plus named storm year. So it's been heavily reliant on these waves, and when they aren't developing, I mean things are just dead quiet. So. Um, it's going to have to come down to how quickly things can kind of sink back south and transition to a more typical pattern.
And we've seen slow starts to seasons before, even when it's been predicted to be a busy season. It doesn't take much before we can have 4 or 5 named storms in a couple of weeks. We're 3 weeks away from peak, but that's 3 weeks still till September, early September, and then you still have the next month after that, which is still pretty active all the way through into early October. So a lot's going to probably change. But again, with the bit of a slower start, I mean, I know you were heavily involved, you and Ken Elliott, with the update for WeatherWorks. So I guess you guys sliced off a couple of numbers. That's it.
Yeah. I early on in the year, our first outlook in May, we had 19 to 23, 9 to 13 hurricanes, and 3 to 6 majors. We just decided to slightly tweak that down to 17 to 21 total named storms, 8 to 12 hurricanes, and then just keeping majors the same at 3 to 6, just because of how things.
Yeah. Well, we've already gotten one, so.
Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't be hard to get at least 2 more. So.
And
I
we had
mean,
Kyle on. I was gonna say we had Kyle on last month too. We were talking a little bit about the tropics and just the summer pattern and how it all kind of melds in together. So, and he was the same thing. Just talking about not much is going to change with the upcoming season. It's still going to be very very busy, and it's just gonna it could just flip a switch and just go crazy.
looking at it in a vacuum, ignoring what happened in August and July, their conditions across the basin are just very, very favorable. You just need stuff to take advantage of it.
Right. And you and I talked about that yesterday when we were just chatting on the phone,
Yeah,
and it
exactly.
just everything's there. It's like all you're gonna bake a cake, all the ingredients are there. You just gotta do it in the right way, and once we get, and there's a lot of ingredients there, so once the atmosphere kind of gets right for the tropics, then all this stuff can just kind of go off like a match and just blow up quick. So we'll definitely be watching that here in the next several weeks. So what about the overall pattern now? I mean, we've got this big trough in the east, which would easily deflect everything. We saw Ernesto stay pretty far off the east coast, but I mean, granted, it's August. A lot of things can change still. It's gonna change again. What's the overall pattern? I mean, are we going to get back into a more of a ridgy pattern here in the east, or are we going to stay with this kind of a trough look?
Um, it really, things have kind of been transient. I would expect that we get back into a more of a ridgy pattern. That's what the long range models have been suggesting. That's what the pattern would suggest. But I mean, I wouldn't be shocked. It's just all going to be about timing. If we do get another trough in the east and we do have something, in the Southwest Atlantic or even the Caribbean, it's a dicey setup. But if we do have something, coming out way in the deep tropics, yeah, it would probably ride out to sea. Um, it's all going to come down to timing. We saw that in 2017. 2010 had a pretty persistent trough over the east that resulted in pretty much everything staying out to sea. So unfortunately, it's all about timing. And I think our 2 main areas of focus, the Caribbean and the islands, some focus on the southeastern United States too. It all pretty much everything remains the same from our initial outlook. It's just really the named storms going down slightly. That's really changed here.
Yeah, and again, you got to owe that to the slower start. And again, we've seen this before, and we've seen other seasons where it jumps out to an early start, and you get 4 or 5 named storms in the first like month or so, and then you have a big lull. And I'm afraid that this year maybe we had just 1 or 2, and then we're in a big lull now again. But come a month from now, we could have that 4 or 5 storms in the Atlantic Basin, and just kind of watching out for all of them.
Yeah. I mean, last year was decent El Nino year, and we still had a bunch of storms. I believe 5 or 6 in September, which is pretty unusual, very unusual. Uh, so, I mean, if we can pull it off in an El Nino year, there's no reason why we can't do it this year when, everything is pretty much there, like you just said. And looking at our analogs, we have about 5 to 6 storms on average for September. Moving into October, we have about 3 to 4, and maybe one additional in November. So I mean, it's looking at the past, things are there for things to pick back up. So we'll just really have to see how things play out. It's gonna be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, it's like the old cliche, it's not a matter of, it's going to happen. It's just when is it going to happen now? It's just basically it's like we're sitting on our hands and just whoa, something's going to go here, and it's just.
Anticipation's killing me here. So
And Mike Priante, he shared Mike this morning. You shared that graph with us on when we were forecasting that ocean heat content of the Gulf. Man, it's
Yeah, although I know it's I mean, from what I saw with the forecast, I mean, Steve, are you seeing like, I know we talked about a little bit about kind of the forecast and maybe a little bit of like when things are going to kind of pop again, but like, as you go into a season, as the track of storms become more favorable in certain areas. So as the Gulf of Mexico probably was more favorable earlier in the season, could that be true? Or like, I know more so now we're kind of leaning more toward more long tracking systems across the Atlantic. So is it still possible we get these short track systems in the Caribbean making it into the Gulf and then blows up in the Gulf and turning into a big storm? Or are those kind of storms becoming less and less likely now as we head deeper into the season?
Oh, I still think they're absolutely possible. The way to get that is if, honestly, I mean, the current setup is how you get it. These waves that exit Africa early on, they can be tangled up with a bunch of dust. They take a long time to develop, just like Debbie did. If Debbie tracked into the Gulf, more into the central Gulf as opposed to the eastern Gulf, it would have been a really big deal. Um, I think it's certainly possible through September, even into a good portion of October. These cool neutral weak La Nina years, they can keep going for a while. So once we shift into mid late September, that's when you start to have to look for things to kind of develop again in the Western Caribbean, just like you do earlier in the year. So if things can lift north, get into the Gulf, and just kind of find the right spot, there is a concerning amount of energy and heat content that's just piled up there right now.
and no, to go back to the point we were talking about those waves coming a little bit further north in latitude. Just looking at some of the guidance here, and then, granted, it's the operational European model and the GFS, but if you look at some of the 0Z runs, you can almost see everything going forward is south now of the Cape Verde Islands. So instead of like coming over it or even a little north of it, where drag that dust out from the Sahara, you can almost see like the wave train setting up further south now. And if you get one of these every 3-4 days, the chance of them developing, of course, goes up really fast.
Yeah, I mean that's what it would take is just things to shift south, and I think it can pick up in a hurry. Like we've been saying, I mean, 1995 had, I believe it was three active storms at the same time, from the Lesser Antilles to the coast of Africa. There was George over Florida at the same time. So I mean,
I remember George's. It was spelled with an S, right? But it was pronounced George.
yeah, it was a that's an interesting name storm, but yeah, I mean, like we've been saying, things can change in a hurry. So just because of a quiet spell here and there, you definitely don't let your guard down. It's the cliche we've also said this episode, like it really only takes one in your area to make it a very bad, memorable season.
Yeah, and the other thing I hear a lot on social media, some of the cliches too, is like, oh, we're due for a hurricane. Yeah, no one's ever due for anything because
No.
you don't have it. If let's say you got a hurricane this last year, it doesn't mean, oh well, the atmosphere says, well, you're not getting one now because you got one last year, or the opposite. Just because Hurricane Bob was the big one to go through. New England, you read about, oh, we're so overdue, but you're 50-50. Either you get hit or you don't. It's just you could get hit 2 years in a row, or you can get missed 10 years in a row. It's just the way it is. It's a setup. If it's right, it's right.
It's interesting because, the whole mentality of we're due for something is not just in tropics, it's also in anything, especially in the winter time. We're
Oh
due for
yeah.
a big snowstorm. It's like, are you really due for something?
But you know what, Mike? I'll give you that. I'll say the one thing. If there's anything that maybe you could be a little more due for, it is kind of like like winter weather or a prolonged winter versus the last couple of years. But yeah, I think I know what you're saying though. I agree.
Here's my problem with that, Brad, though, is that it's all coming down to a perspective of just like probability, right? So like the atmosphere is chaotic. Obviously, the atmosphere doesn't care if you in Connecticut not get a big major snowstorm one year because maybe somewhere else is going to get a big snowstorm and then they're happy, right? But like I don't know if the person in that area that gets a snowstorm is saying, "Wow, yeah, it's been how many years? We were certainly due for a storm." It's just the way way the atmosphere works, right? You know, but sometimes, obviously, not to discredit, there are certain times when certain years are more favorable, and that kind of leads back to what we were talking about with tropics. It's more favorable for a landfalling hurricane of a category 3 or more. But that's not to say that like Florida is due for a hurricane. It's like, well, probability could probably put you that way, right? Like you're due for something because, well, you're Florida, you're sticking out. There's a lot of, you're so far south in terms of latitude. The chances, right? But like, do you say that in Maine? We're due for a hurricane. Well, it's Maine, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I mean, the chances of Maine getting a landfalling hurricane. Look at history. It's like very, very unlikely. So it's not that they're due for one. It's just that it's the probability says you're not as likely.
Well, look at Eastern Canada. They've had what last 4 out of 5 years. They've been.
They've gotten beat up. They've definitely gotten beat up out there. Yeah, I mean it's like the eastern coast of Florida. Like I don't think they've had anything too insane as far as like a major hurricane making landfall since 2005. I think was their last one. So it's been like Priante said. I mean the atmosphere does whatever it's going to want to do. So um, this year is certainly more favorable for things to go wrong somewhere. It's going to depend on the pattern and where exactly that is.
And like Mike was just talking about it a little bit earlier about with this kind of I guess with all the fuel out there, if you will, will that extend further into the hurricane season? What was it one year we got all the way through into December? We had like Greek storms going.
Oh, that was 2020. Yeah.
Was that 20? Oh no, there's another one before that. I thought.
Oh,
Another.
2005. 2005
Yeah,
to
maybe that was
2020
the
were
one.
the only.
That was a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we don't even use the.
Well, both years. Yeah, both years. I mean, the hurricane season just didn't seem like November 30th is a quote official ending, but I remember named storms going all the way into December that year.
Yeah, there was like Zeta and like the crazy names way the heck past when you're supposed to still be seeing stuff. So you never know. No one expected that year to be that insane, and it was the most active hurricane season on record at the time until 2020. So, um, yeah, a lot can change, and that oceanic heat content that you were talking about, it really doesn't go anywhere um, until the winter. I mean, the only way it gets really used up is if you have slow moving storms.
Storms are going up well, everything. Yeah.
Yeah, but the waters of the Caribbean are, pretty deep. So it would take at least a couple to really put a dent in that at this point.
I guess another thing that I wanted to add was maybe this could be a theory as to why things have been quiet. I mean, the Pacific has been pretty active. I don't know if that has any implications into the Atlantic.
Great point. Tropical cyclone activity as a whole across the northern hemisphere is about 50% of normal. The eastern Pacific has been very quiet, and the western Pacific, the typhoon season has been remarkably quiet outside of your uh, typhoon here and there. But in the eastern Pacific, they've had 7 storms, but they've all been sheared, very weak, very brief. Um, it's just I don't think anyone has a good reason as to why that's happening right now, which makes it even more interesting as we go forward to see what happens. I'm sure someone's going to do a paper on the last 2 months in the Atlantic, maybe even the whole northern hemisphere, to kind of figure out what's happening. But yeah, tropical cyclone activity as a whole is down across the northern hemisphere right now.
Then you go all the way back to the volcano, and you wonder if like a couple of years
Yeah.
ago that has some kind of ties to it where there's too much. I read about that kind of stuff, but you just never know what.
Yeah, it would be nice if you were able to tie, things like that to an event like that. But I think it's going to take years before we figure out the real implications of that. You're just pumping a tremendous amount of water vapor up into the stratosphere. It's nuts.
I know. It's almost like you almost kind of want to blame it on something because when you don't have when you don't have an answer for something, you're almost kind of like, why this should be happening? Like physically on paper, we looked at everything. Why is it not happening? Then you want to look for an answer, and then it's just like, oh, well, the volcano's to blame. It's like it's all your fault.
Yeah.
It's like we're now it's a scapegoat.
It's funny
know?
because it's people just get frustrated and
I
like,
know.
I need an answer. I need an answer as to why things aren't panning
Well,
out.
that's how things are these days. Everything it has to be an answer to every question, and
Yeah.
it's,
Sometimes it's okay to say, I don't know.
I know. Well, it's stuff in the weather business. People want you to know, right? As a meteorologist.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
but again, we know the potential's there because look at Beryl. How and Beryl went through a spot. Usually, what they usually call that the graveyard, a lot of times,
Yep.
and especially at that time of the year when it went, was early July, and you have a Cat 5 going. I mean, so obviously there's plenty of fuel there to get. So now as we getting into the peak of the season, I mean, do we get a Cat 6 hurricane? Oh wait, I'm not supposed to mention that.
No.
No
You
such
gotta edit
thing.
that out.
I know. But it's always been talked about. You always read about it. They add a Cat 6 one day.
We could have a whole
I know, I know.
debate on the
Brad, you're
whole.
gonna get us down a rabbit hole with that. Come on.
I
Yeah.
know, I know.
But yeah, I mean, Brad's right. Before, what was it? 2016 with Matthew was the first Category 5 in the Eastern Caribbean, or I think anywhere in the Caribbean since 2007. So I mean, we've gone years and years without something like that out there. To get it in June, it still blows my mind. I look at the map every now and then of this season, and it feels fake. It feels like like a weather weenie kind of drew up that track map. It's just insane.
And at that point, then too, we're like, oh my God, this is the B storm, and we've got a Cat 5 in the Caribbean. And what does that mean now for the rest of the season? Now we're in big trouble. But luckily, it's kind of tapered off, for the last 2 months. But again, the potential's there, obviously. So it's not going to take too much to get maybe another Cat 5 in there.
Maybe the atmosphere just saw like Beryl, and it's just like, well, you know what? That's about it. You get your Cat 5 hurricane in June, and I'm good. All the energy's there. There's your ace. There's everything, and I'm gonna pack it up, and I'll come back in September. That's kind of what the atmosphere said, right?
Let the ace catch up to normal, then I'll throw a couple of big ones your way
Yeah.
again.
Yeah, that would be equally as impressive as like a hyperactive year to me. It's just an insane bust like that. But unfortunately, I don't think that's in the cards for the severe weather junkies out there. Like this season kind of feels like a plains tornado outbreak setup where all the ingredients are there, but you have a bit of a cap kind of limiting things, and you're just kind of wondering whether or not that cap's going to break. And that's kind of where we're at. Is just things are kind of limited at the
They're
moment.
percolating.
Yeah. You just got to see when exactly that is.
Yeah, it's definitely gonna be a waiting game here going forward. But like you said, we're headed towards peak, and September could be a complete opposite of what we've had in August, where it's just storm after storm, and we're tracking one recurves, but the next one right behind it, the trough, maybe the trough exits because of the first one, and you see that a lot. You see like, oh well, the first storm's going to recur because there's a perfect trough there, but then the next one, the trough's gone and it sneaks underneath everything, and there you go, and now it's in the Caribbean, and now it's a U.S. Possibility.
And as you guys know, I mean, like those recurving storms, I mean, they kind of put a wrench in the pattern, the long-standing pattern that you've had. So it can shuffle it up, and instead of a trough, you get a ridge, 7 days later out in the east. And if you have something, down in the Caribbean or, east of the islands, it could be a big issue. So it's very nowcasty.
Yeah, even Ernesto, when it first got going, there were some model data that was, at least some of the ensembles were trying to bring it pretty close to the East Coast. But then we got those series of troughs and a couple of cold fronts that we didn't think. Then the cold fronts were going to be too far east, or it was going to be too far west, and the ridge was going to build back in, and they were going to pull Ernesto back. So I mean, a lot of different. Even same thing with Debbie. Which look at Debbie. I mean, Debbie was supposed to actually really go out to sea at first, and then that one went further and further west, and it really impacted a lot of the East Coast. That was crazy.
Yeah, land interaction with Debbie was an absolute nightmare to forecast. I mean, uh, one of the reasons that Debbie was actually able to form was that its interaction with Hispaniola was, in a very simple way, was able to help it tighten up from being this big, broad, sloppy wave. And that it popping south of Cuba, also helped. It was just the interaction with the terrain was a nightmare. Debbie was bad, but if it went a little bit more west, like some of the models kind of had it near like Panama City, maybe even like Mississippi, like you would have been talking about a major hurricane easily.
And that's what makes every storm so different. I mean, granted, by the time the storm's formed, and we usually have a decent idea of where it's headed, but like you said, these sloppy storms don't have a good center yet. I mean, the models are just you can't go by any operational models that are more than 3 days out, because again, it's a lot of it. One little tweak on one member of the ensembles, it's different from everything else, and that's why there's so many different solutions when it comes down to these storms. So,
oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And I mean, a lot of people don't understand that, but I think the big takeaway is just don't let your guard down. I mean, unless it's November and you're in the clear here, I think everyone's got to pay attention, especially if you have interests in the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast, the Southeast United States. Definitely keep an eye out this year, because all the conditions are there. We just need something to pop.
Well, I think that just about does it, guys. Mike, you got anything else you want to add?
No, I think this was very enlightening here.
We'll leave Steve alone the rest of the season now for the tropics. We'll, unless we get like hammered in September or October, and we're like, when's this stopping? When's this
Might have
ending?
to drag me out.
I think what we need to do, Brad, is by the end of the season, or at least close to it, if it looks like we're going to be winding down here, we have Steve back on.
Yeah, I'll do a recap.
And we'll talk about the season. We'll see what happened, and maybe we can see like, okay, well, here's what happened. Maybe we have an answer. Maybe there's something we can talk about, and maybe we won't have to blame the volcano. Well, we'll see.
Yeah, that would be great. That'd be great.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for coming on again, Steve, and we'll keep in touch, I'm sure, throughout the rest of the season here. And yeah, that's about wraps it up for this today's episode. And again, while we're focused on the tropics right now and end of summer, WeatherWorks here, we're only about a month away from the official start of fall. And you know what that means? Soon we'll release our early predictions for the upcoming winter season. So be sure to subscribe to the Weather Lounge, and you'll get notified when that airs. And again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
That's a wrap on this week's episode of the Weather Lounge podcast. Thanks for listening. Be sure to follow us on all your favorite podcasting platforms so you don't miss out on future episodes. Have questions or comments? Just email us at weatherlounge@weatherworksinc.com. We'd love to hear your feedback. You can also learn more about our parent company, WeatherWorks, by visiting weatherworksinc.com and checking them out on social media as well. Thanks again for joining us, and until next time, stay curious and stay weather-wise.